Right, good afternoon, everybody. I would imagine you're joining and being let in. I can see there's a number of people being admitted into the waiting room, but I'm conscious that we've got quite a bit to get through, and we don't want to trespass on your time too much, especially as this webinar is in the middle of the day. But the idea is that hopefully we're going to give you something to think about over your lunch break and more generally. So let's get into it. Social media regulation. So we'll get the dull bits out of the way first, if I may. If I can make this work. So that's me. I'm a partner at a law firm called BLM. I lead the firm's creative, digital and marketing sector, which means I get to be a geek for a living, as you can probably see from my background and the topic of this conversation in particular. We'll get just to run through the standard stuff. That's the logo of our creative, digital and marketing team. We launched a commercial advisory offering at the end of 2017. We're everything you'd expect from a law firm, so property, corporate, commercial, IP, media, privacy, with a specific niche in the creative and digital sector. And we've got some interesting stuff to tell you about if you'd like to hear about it at some other point. But I'm not going to do much of a sales pitch, if any, for the purpose of this, because, as I say, we've got a lot to get through to cover what I hope to in terms of learning objectives. So starting off with this, I'm always aware of the fact that some people come to this topic with a bit of cynicism, and I understand why, in terms of understanding or wanting to understand the impacts of social media on society, and certainly in the UK. I mean, we've seen it. We were just having a discussion before cameras started rolling around the effect that it has on everyday lives, and it's certainly changing our world. You can argue for the better or for the worse. But it's having a real impact on the way we live our lives. And the only way to really get that across is to give you some stats. So there is a particularly good piece of work every year that's done by Hootsuite, We Are Social and Kepios, well, done various times a year, called the Digital Insert Number of Year Here report. And to give you an idea of some of the impact that social media is having on us, we have a population in the UK as of January this year of just over 68 million people. Of that, 65 million people are internet users in the UK. That's 96% penetration. We have 53 million social media users in the UK, or just under 78% penetration, and that was a growth of 2.3 million people over the preceding year, or 4%. In the UK, we have 67.61 million mobile phone connections. That's 99.4% of the total population. And probably a lot more because many people have more than one mobile phone. That's a slight decrease, but the importance of that, I think, is that social media doesn't involve you anymore sitting down in front of a laptop or a desktop computer to make your voice known. We see people holding up their phones like this, smacking into each other in the street every day of the week because they're busy tweeting or posting about whatever's come to mind. And opinion can spread that quickly, you know, and certainly social media content can spread that quickly. So there's a chance that the vast majority of the UK has a mobile phone, and there's also a chance that they're using that phone to engage through social media. Social media adoption is absolutely surging globally. We had a 13% increase last year to 4.2 billion people. So just think of the percentage of the world's population that covers. 1.3 million social media users join a platform every day during 2020, and that comes to 15.5 people per second. The average social media user spends about 2 hours 25 minutes on social media every day, roughly 1 day a week. And the average time, this is really going to depress you, I think, the average time spent using mobile devices each day is now 4 hours and 10 minutes. 44% of that time is spent on social media and communications, 26% in watching videos, so Netflix, Prime and so on, and entertainment apps, 9% gaming and 21% other. That other's probably e-commerce, shopping, eBay, that kind of thing. And it's true to say that mobile phones, especially at the moment, account for a greater amount of the internet across all devices in the UK is around 6 hours 45 minutes, with a total of 3 hours 24 minutes spent on social media. So everybody's at it now, whether we like to admit to that or not. And in terms of the league, the charter, the platforms, Facebook, by far the biggest social media platform in the world. But what's really interesting when you look at this, this chart here is that Facebook also owns WhatsApp, Messenger and Instagram. So just think of the sheer reach of that one platform. It's absolutely huge. So if you wanted to say, you know, social media is for the geeks, it's for kids, nobody really bothers about it, These figures, among a load of others that are put out every single year, should hopefully be dispelling that opinion. So, against the backdrop of all of this, the UK has decided that it wants to try and regulate online harms, and through doing so, social media. We'll be the first country in the world to do so. We'd like to think we're leading the way. The idea behind all of this, as stated when it first came around in 2019, was to make the UK the safest place in the world to be online, as this slide suggests. So a white paper was launched in April 2019 that was aimed to create a culture of transparency, trust, and accountability. It's all about responsibility rather than liability. And part of the reason for it was the number of very serious incidents involving encouragement of suicide, terrorist content propagating over social media, and the fact that the platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram had been given, I think in the eyes of the government and many in the public, any number of chances to try and get this right, to try and do more to protect their users. In particular, Facebook tried to do so in relation to child online safety. But in the wake of tragedies like the Molly Russell suicide, for example, the direction of travel and the public sentiment has very much been that some kind of regulation is necessary and desirable, and that's what's coming. So this new legislation, as and when we see the online safety bill, is going to make companies responsible for their users' safety online, especially children, especially vulnerable groups, and it's going to make them tackle harm caused by content or activity on their services. Underpinning all of this is going to be the need to comply with a brand new statutory, rather than built on case law, duty of care that's going to be overseen and enforced by an independent regulator. And I'll get to who that is as we go through the slides. That consultation, which to be fair raised an awful lot of eyebrows, closed on the 1st of July 2019 with an interim response published in February 2020, noting that a number of rights organisations, quite rightly, had raised complaints and concerns over the possible impact of all of this upon freedom of expression. But it also noted that this new regime doesn't require the removal of content. What it requires businesses, platforms, and so on and so forth to do is introduce appropriate safeguards to deter online harm. Now, if that sounds familiar, that's very similar to the approach taken in data protection legislation, in that you've got to have policies, procedures, systems, processes in place to ensure that you protect personal data and uphold privacy. Now, this is a bit more wide-ranging than that, and not quite as technical, but the general approach is very similar, and I'll get into the detail of that in due course. Much of this work, though, was expected to be done by the platforms through changing their user terms, through communicating better with their user base. And there was also a large concern raised over who's going to fall under the scope of this, in that once we have just got over the GDPR coming in 3 years ago, which turned the volume up on data protection requirements, we're now going to be faced with this. Many worried that this would be just one more set of compliance that they need to worry about, that they need to invest disproportionate sums in making sure they're on the right side of the law. But the government made it very clear that the duty of care they're talking about is only going to apply to businesses that facilitate the sharing of user-generated content, and businesses with just a social media presence, so just a profile on Twitter or Facebook, Insta, whatever, are not necessarily caught by it. The idea was that the regulatory burden on small businesses was going to be minimised. The estimate was that only 5% of UK businesses would actually fall within the scope of this particular new set of legislation. So far, so good, you might think. When we get to December 15th last year, when the final outcome with a picture of Oliver Dowden and Priti Patel was published by DCMS, what that outcome said is that the online safety bill will be published sometime this year, although we haven't seen any hint of it just yet. Ofcom, the broadcast regulator, is also going to be the online harms regulator. They are recruiting for 150 people in Manchester alone to deal with this new requirement on them. And it's going to be funded by regulatory fees payable by businesses above a set global annual revenue threshold. The idea behind all of this, having taken into account all of the responses to the white paper, is to prevent the proliferation of illegal content and activity online, with the emphasis on protecting children from being exposed to harmful content. But interestingly, fake news falls under online harm as well, in that disinformation and misinformation, which could cause harm to individuals, is also going to be in scope. And what we're talking about there, of course, is COVID-19 anti-vax content and the like. if people are being convinced that a vaccine is bad for them and they shouldn't take it, it's experimental, it's got microchips in by Bill Gates or whatever else, that falls squarely within the remit of the online harms that we're talking about here. And as I mentioned earlier, what businesses that are in scope are going to have to do is introduce systems and processes to improve user safety. Although the revised figures suggest that actually not 5%, but 3% of UK businesses are going to fall within the scope of this new legislation, many of which are going to be exempt from any kind of regulatory fee. There's a real focus here on risk-based compliance, and again, that carries over from data protection law. The focus is on regulating companies that pose the biggest risk of harm to their users. Technology is going to play a crucial role in improving user safety, and that's especially prescient when it comes to social media platforms, because the argument has very often been made that sure, they can change an algorithm and just sort all of this out. Now, it's obviously more complex than that, but it is envisioned that technology is going to play a very big role in how this rolls out. And what the government has said, made very clear, is that what they're looking to do here is introduce proportionate enforcement, although they can fine businesses up to £18 million or 10, sorry, that should be or rather than of, or 10% of their global annual turnover, whichever is higher. More importantly, not only are they going to be able to do this, there are going to be other sanctions open to them, including business disruption measures that I'll get onto, and potentially within a couple of years, the introduction of criminal sanctions against senior managers who fail to comply when Ofcom asks them to do so. So it's pretty wide-ranging stuff. And again, GDPR has kind of set the tone for a lot of this discussion, and we'll get into it in a bit more detail here. The duty of care I mentioned before is intended to hold big tech to account based on a set of guiding principles, and I'll tell you what they are shortly. There'll be different levels of expectation depending upon whether or not services in question are used by adults or children, and certainly if they're used by children, more will be expected of them. There's going to be a tiered approach where businesses that fall within category 2 are going to need to take proportionate steps to deal with illegal content and protect children. And category 1 is going to include businesses with a wider reach. So basically that's going to be your Facebook, Twitter, other social media platforms. There are going to be new rules that apply to public communication platforms where users expect a bit more privacy. And any business in scope is going to need to have a think about and explain the impact of any measures that they take on individual privacy to make sure that the rights of the individual are balanced against all of this. Ofcom is going to be empowered to require platforms to use technology, as I mentioned earlier, to identify child sexual exploitation, abuse and terrorist content subject to a number of safeguards, sorry, Freudian slip. And we are going to see relatively soon, or at least hopefully as soon as possible after legislation comes in, a number of codes of practice that are going to be administered and written by Ofcom with some governmental oversight that will fill in the gaps in this legislation, that will give practical real-world advice on how businesses can comply with their new expectations, their new obligations. They're going to identify effective alternative approaches, and we have already interim codes in place on child sexual exploitation, abuse and terrorist content. There are also going to need to be mechanisms for user reporting of harmful content, and an appeal procedure, so that if what you're saying actually isn't harmful and it's just iconoclastic, free speech will still be respected. And it's also possible that the forthcoming online safety bill is going to implement Law Commission recommendations on changes to the existing communications offences, because there are plenty of criminal offences that apply to what you do or don't do on social media, but they're a little bit out of date now, and reform of them is very much ongoing. We've seen new offences such as revenge porn, for example, introduced over the course of the last few years as technology evolves and behaviour evolves with it. So, having said all of this, who is this going to affect and how is it going to affect them? So when GDPR came in, we saw an awful lot of people being emailed saying, you are going to get a €20 million fine, you don't comply, we can make you 100% compliant, we are certified consultants, so on and so on and so on. And there was widespread panic, understandably so, but data protection law really didn't change that much in terms of how it operates. Sanctions and the volume of the whole thing was turned up a bit more. This is new, and it's going to impose, I'd say, probably a similar kind of burden on businesses that fall in scope, but that's, I think, the key point there. Your business has to fall in scope, and not many, I think, if the government's figures are right, will. So there's a clear aim here at regulating bigger businesses and regulating big tech. The legislation we're talking about, the Online Safety Bill, is going to apply to companies whose services host user-generated content or facilitate interaction between users, one or more of whom is based in the UK. And it's also going to apply to search engines. What it's not going to apply to are any business that plays a functional role in enabling online activity, so web hosts, ISPs, and it's not going to apply to business services either. But this goes to show you the facilitation of interaction between users. You can argue that's a bulletin board on a company website. That's potentially how far this could stretch. But the vast majority of businesses simply don't have any kind of presence that enables this sort of functionality. There are going to be exemptions applied if the risk of harm to users is so low that the regulatory requirements would be disproportionate. And as I said before, search engines will be included. That's potentially seismic, in that there may be another argument now to have content taken down off search engines made by individuals because it's causing harm, and so the governmental intervention as well. Freedom of expression, media freedom is going to be protected, and the way they're going to do that is by ensuring that any kind of material produced and published by the press is going to fall out of the scope of the online harms regime, along with any comments underneath those articles on the original sites. Now, that's not going to extend to user-generated content, so say a comment where somebody shares a link and they do so on a different platform. But the idea here is that you should still have robust debate. If that, however, that link and that content is weaponized to cause harm, then that's the kind of thing that is going to fall into scope. But again, not the original platform that the article was published on. There's going to be robust public protection for journalistic content. And as I said before, citizen journalists could be a really interesting area here. And we see an awful lot more of them. And we see an awful lot more of news content being shared very selectively along with, say, anti-vaxxer information. And that's the kind of harm that, again, this is looking to discourage. As I said before, compliance is going to be risk-based, flexible and proportionate, and that's very, very similar to what we see in GDPR. If you have just a standard B2B bulletin board, then the chances are this isn't going to apply to you. And you can see the way this has been drafted does take aim squarely at big tech, as I keep mentioning. In terms of regulatory fines, well, they're similar to the kind of thing you'd see under the UK GDPR regime. And it's fair to say that we're not going to see high-end fines or high-value fines for quite some time, even after the new regime comes in. When the GDPR came in, we had about 2 years of a phony war while we were waiting for businesses, large or small, to start receiving some of the bigger fines that they'd been promised to be about to receive as and when GDPR came in. And it's going to take a while, as I said, for codes of practice, for regulatory approaches to be filled out, for the wider business community to get used to these new requirements. So we might see some action taken urgently in response to a particular event, but it's going to be a while before we get a better idea of as and when fines or how and when fines are going to be administered and the kind of fines that are levied for particular kinds of harm that goes unaddressed. The duty of care, however, could prove really problematic in that the chances are, because this isn't a duty of care that's evolved out of, say, 20, 30 years of case law, this could give rise to civil claims against platforms, and it could give rise to class actions as well. Currently, one of the biggest and most important class actions the UK has seen in quite some time, actually last week, was heard by the Supreme Court in a case called Lloyd versus Google. That's all about a data protection dispute involving the use of browser-generated information by Google up and down an advertising network without the knowledge or consent of the people that were involved. And if Lloyd versus Google goes the way we expect it to, it may only serve to underpin and enable opt-out US-style class actions in the UK. So while it will take a few years for the new regime to bed down, you can bet your bottom dollar that you will see claims farmers looking to start to gather together group claims where harm can be shown to have been caused, because ultimately a lot of that's going to be subjective. But this may well turn out to be another very fruitful line of litigation for claimant firms up and down the country on that basis. So having said all that, what's in scope? Loads is the answer. It's fair to say, as I mentioned earlier, that the public largely supports regulation of social media. You may be familiar with the absolutely tragic case of Molly Russell, who found pro-suicide content on Instagram and took her own life very, very sadly. There's apparently broad support for this proposed approach in the responses to the white paper and across the wider public as well. And as I mentioned earlier, a business falls into scope their services host user-generated content, so that's not what they create, but just users of their services, that can be accessed in the UK, or that facilitates public or private interaction between users, one or more of whom is based in the UK. Now, the reason the references to the UK are important there is that this is going to be extraterritorial. So potentially this is going to apply to businesses based outside the UK, but have some kind of impact on UK users or some presence in the UK. This duty of care that I mentioned is only really intended to cover businesses with direct control over the content and activity on their services. And as I said before, B2B services are going to be exempt, along with low-risk functionality services or anyone playing a functional role in enabling online activity. But anyone who plays that functional role will need to comply, if asked, with the business disruption measures I'll mention shortly. So we've got new definitions introduced into the income legislation to cover user-generated content, user-generated interaction, but there's little room for argument over their scope and extent, in that to fall under this remit, the content in question must have been viewed by someone other than their original creator, and that's actually very similar to the way that the communications offences are already drafted. That interaction can be public or private, with the potential to generate user-generated content. And again, I've mentioned it a couple of times now, it's really notable that search engines fall within the scope of this online harms regime. There's a burden on providers now to introduce technical solutions that reduce exposure to and promotion of harmful content. So again, those new specific codes of practice are going to be introduced that will fill in the gaps as and when, along with voluntary best practice guidance that's going to be separate from this regime. It's just going to be a good idea that businesses comply. For years and years, I know I keep mentioning data protection, but it's really useful context when you're looking at this. For years, businesses said, well, we'll comply with data protection one day. Many saw it as an aspirational aim to look at some point. When the GDPR and now the UK GDPR came in, that aspirational aim changed from one day to today. And the aspirational aim here of preventing harm to users, again, is going to be imposed on businesses and is going to be imposed on them quite hard if they fall in scope. So that voluntary best practice guidance and those codes of practice are going to be absolutely key, because the more you get into these proposals, the language of them is a little bit arcane, and it is, quite frankly, fairly scary to a lot of businesses if they think they do fall in scope and have to change the way they deal with compliance. Journalism is going to be protected, again, provided that that content actually comes from the press, and also debatable online comments is going to be exempt, again, mainly due to the fact that that's fairly low risk functionality. However, if you're a journalist that is using social media to find stories, then that's kind of activity is going to remain subject to platform terms. And you may say, well, what about advertising? Well, advertising online is already largely covered by self-regulatory codes across social media. About 10 years ago, the ASA, that's the Advertising Standards Authority, broadened its online remit to cover pretty much any kind of marketing communication that's disseminated in any way, shape or form in the UK. And self-regulatory codes are handy because it means the government doesn't have to introduce new legislation to regulate advertising. Advertising law is based around consumer protection law immediately. And self-regulatory codes work in that everybody in the advertising industry buys into them, and a levy funds the operation of the ASA. So if the ASA tells you to pull an advert, people agree to do so. They have sanctions that can include the denial of advertising space, they can adjudicate against people, but in a self-regulatory body, they can't fine anyone. So there's always been a bit of debate about whether or not advertising could be more harshly regulated, more closely regulated, and the government is going to look at the regulation of online advertising in the first half of this year, or intends to look at it within the first half of this year. Behind the Advertising Standards Authority sits the Competition and Markets Authority. They enforce the consumer protection regulation, and they're taking a more active role in relation to marketing, communications and advertising, notably around the influencer space, because influencers for a long time haven't been particularly transparent, haven't made it very clear when they're being paid to create content or to promote a product, and there has long been a suggestion that their behaviour has a direct impact on the purchasing behaviour of individuals, which can potentially cause them harm. So the CMA and others called for more action here when the online harms legislation was being pulled together, when the approach with the white papers being pulled together, to take more action on financial scams. Martin Lewis, as you would imagine, has been doing an awful lot of work to try and get scams into the online harms legislation, so far unsuccessfully. But the Advertising Standards Authority has been active throughout COVID-19. and the CMA may become more interventionist over time. They have done before, and it looks as if that's the direction of travel. In terms of the duty of care, well, the duty of care that businesses are going to have to comply with is to deal with any content or activity which gives rise to a reasonably foreseeable, sorry about the typo there, risk of harm to individuals and has a significant impact on those users or other people. So that's a reasonably foreseeable risk of harm and a significant impact. There are a limited number of priority categories to worry about set out in secondary legislation. The original list of harms that this was all meant to cover included sexting, child sex abuse, access to pornography, revenge porn, hate crimes, harassment, sale of illegal goods, cyberbullying, trolling, fake news and disinformation, and material that advocates self-harm and suicide. That has been narrowed slightly, and the new legislation isn't going to change any existing liability, whether criminal or civil, for individual pieces of content that meet the definition of harm. But it is going to require an understanding of the risk and new policies and procedures to be introduced. There are additional provisions around disinformation and misinformation that's based on the activity of an expert working group that's looking at this to build consensus, largely based around the experience in the COVID-19 pandemic of vaccine hesitancy and vaccine hysteria. So what we've had over the course of the last 12 months is a fantastic, well, I wouldn't use the word fantastic to describe the last 12 months, but we've had a real case study on the impact that disinformation and misinformation can have on wider society, whether you're looking at it through a political or through a health context. The original range of harms that I mentioned earlier was pretty dynamic and pretty wide-ranging, and it led to some significant concern among respondents to the white paper. The idea was that these new online harms were meant to cover issues that fell between a number of legislative stools. So things that were, so activity that wasn't a criminal offence, for example, there wasn't a civil infringement or a breach of the Data Protection Act or something similar. This was meant to hoover up everything else without having to introduce new civil or criminal liability. And the new legislation is going to define the scope as covering reasonably foreseeable risk of significant adverse physical or psychological impacts on individuals. So the harms that I kind of alluded to earlier, IP infringement, data protection, fraud, consumer protection, and hacking is all going to be excluded from the scope of online harms because there's plenty of legislation to deal with it already. The view is that online fraud is best tackled through other mechanisms, and it has been tackled by Serious Fraud Office, but there is increasing pressure from which money-saving expert and others to bring fraud into these proposals. And I think that's a discussion that's still ongoing. Certainly MPs are talking about it a lot. And as I mentioned earlier, the duty of care we're talking about here has now been refined and split into two parts. There's a duty on the businesses to comply and upon Ofcom as the new regulator to uphold that brand new duty of care and to enforce compliance with it where necessary. The risk-based compliance that I mentioned earlier is going to depend upon the risk of harm occurring by what businesses do online, the profile and demographics of their users, and their market share or the size of business. So again, looking at that, it's easy for small businesses to think they may fall in scope, but as you can see, the government is really taking aim here against big tech. There's a proposed safety by design framework, which Ofcom is looking at, that would be similar to the GDPR's privacy by design approach. And it's important to remember that this isn't intended to eliminate the harms that we're talking about. What it's meant to do is improve user safety in the short term. So user reporting of harmful content is to platforms and to businesses in scope is going to be the heart of this new approach, but so is redress. There needs to be some kind of appeal system. We've seen in the last 24 hours in the US that Donald Trump's ban from Facebook was subject to Facebook's oversight board making a decision about whether or not it should continue. And what they said was that although the decision around the January 6th riots to cut Donald Trump off of Facebook was right and was proper, for an indefinite suspension to remain in place would need a lot more explanation. There would need to be some kind of right to appeal, there needs to be some kind of right to redress, and that's very much at the heart of these proposals. There needs to be some kind of appeal system. More importantly, although I mentioned civil claims, this isn't meant to create any new avenues for individuals to sue companies. However, what it's going to do is make legal action more accessible to users as the evidence base grows, and regulatory rulings can be used in support of claims in the event that harm has been caused or suffered by individuals. There's going to be no one-size-fits-all approach to compliance, and that's a bad and a good thing at the same time, mainly due to the fact that, like the ICO, Ofcom isn't going to tell you exactly what you should do or rubber stamp anything in particular. What they're going to do is provide guidance, But businesses are going to be expected to take action in relation to relevant content and activity, and to do so, remove that content expeditiously. Expeditiously is an existing definition from e-commerce legislation, alongside the risk of it appearing and spreading being minimised through their effective systems. So you're meant to have processes in place that stop this kind of harm and to take action quickly once it's identified. And more importantly, the emphasis on businesses assessing the likelihood of children to access their services is also important. If they do, then businesses are going to need to introduce additional protections. There's certainly a far higher burden on the very limited number of Category 1 services that I mentioned before. That's meant to address the expectation gap between their safety policies and user experience. Anyone who's been on Facebook for more than 5 minutes will know the general mantra. If you want to start an argument online, express an opinion and wait. Now, this isn't necessarily going to cover freedom of expression, as I mentioned before. That's been prioritised and protected at the heart of these new proposals. But it's fair to say that if you spend any amount of time online, you will see the kind of harmful content that you can be exposed to. The existing takedown regime through the e-commerce regulations looks like it's going to remain in place for a while. That's important because if you're asked to take content down on the basis of it being a civil wrong or a criminal offence, then the idea is that if you take that down expeditiously, you can't be punished any further, either through criminal or civil means as a result. But we're outside the EU now, and the e-commerce regulations were based heavily on UK law. We're going to diverge from EU law over time, and this means that the takedown regime may change, and actually the online harms takedown regime may become more relevant to a lot of businesses. As I mentioned, freedom of expression is very, very protected, or at least as far as it can be, at the heart of these proposals. But the issue of anonymous abuse is also going to be addressed. There's going to be no new limits brought in on online anonymity, but there are going to be effective systems and processes that are going to be expected to fill that gap, as well as user terms put in place by the platforms that are consistently and clearly enforced and explained to their users. The issue of anonymity is still being reviewed, mainly due to the review of criminal offences. But that's with the understanding that the line between illegal and legal behaviour isn't particularly well understood by social media users. Social media has only really been a thing for 20, 25 years tops, and it's fair to say that many users simply don't know what they could get in trouble for on the basis of what they post online. So there is going to be a big education piece that comes alongside of all of this, and certainly the idea of online harms getting into the zeitgeist, people being more aware of harms and their effect, may well serve to only help to explain to people the kind of harm that they themselves could cause, as well as the kind of harm that could be propagated by the businesses that we're talking about. And as I mentioned, there's going to be higher levels of protection for children than adults through child safety risk assessments. The codes of practice that Ofcom are going to produce are going to focus on the hard edge of all of this, what you need to do in practice, the kind of systems, processes and governance that you're going to need to put into place to comply, and they're not going to focus so much on the categories of harm. As I mentioned, the CSE code, the terrorism code, some codes of practice are already in place in draft form with the announcement back in the 15th of December, and any new codes brought in are going to be subject to really wide-ranging consultation and lobbying by the tech businesses to capture existing expertise, and there's also going to be parliamentary oversight over them, at least before they're introduced. I mentioned technology several times earlier, and the use of automated technology to reduce harms caused is only going to be mandated by Ofcom where there's no other way to get to where they need to. However, child sexual exploitation content through private channels is going to be an early focus alongside terrorism, and although, again, there are going to be brand new compliance requirements, there's going to be no further requirements in relation to the reporting of criminal activity or the retention of related data. That's going to be dealt with through separate legislation. But again, thinking about the COVID-19 pandemic, what the full response by the government did say was that where disinformation and misinformation presents a significant threat to public safety, public health or national security, the regulator will have the power to act. It notes that disinformation can be legal but harmful, because fake news is actually quite difficult to define legally. It's been the subject of a couple of defamation claims in particular. But the idea here is that, again, platform user terms, even though nobody reads them, are going to emphasise this issue, are going to make it clear to users that spreading fake news is not going to be tolerated on these sites anymore. And you may say, well, why was Ofcom chosen? Mainly on the basis that they're a broadcast regulator, they deal with content, and the new regime works to empower them as an existing regulatory body. They've already had quite a lot of input into the audio-visual media service regulations relating to online video content, and they've got a good track record of engagement with the wider public and the wider community. So what the government saw this as was a logical extension of their existing remit based on their experience in broadcasting. The choice pretty much came down to either them or the ICO, and to be honest, the ICO has enough on its hands at the moment, still dealing with the fallout of data protection reforms. So Ofcom's objective here, again, we say it time and time again, is to improve safety for users of online services. They'll accept complaints from users alongside super complaints based on systemic issues affecting large numbers of people. And as we've mentioned, codes of practice are going to set out what businesses need to do to comply with the duty of care. Sorry, that's a typo. I will make sure I run through all of this before I make the slides available, alongside a transparency, trust and accountability framework. Enforcement, when it's brought to bear, is going to be prompt and effective, but also appropriate and proportionate. Again, very similar to the approach in the GDPR. Startups and SMEs who fall within scope are going to be supported by Ofcom, and innovation, education and awareness of online harms is going to be promoted through a public education campaign alongside research into the impacts on individuals. I think that's going to be really important because we hear about some terrible instances of online harassment, online harm, defamation, criminal threats, without much emphasis really being placed on the victim. I think it's fair to say that your average user of social media doesn't really appreciate the harm that what they say can cause. You know, we see death threats, we see toxic fandom every day online, and really emphasising the impact on individuals, showing what kind of harm it can cause, may well start to change the tide or turn the tide of what users think is going to be acceptable. There are, so just let me get back into that. So yes, the Ofcom is going to have information gathering and investigating powers to support their investigations, again similar to GDPR, including a requirement to have businesses undertake and paid for a skilled persons report on an area of concern. So much as we've seen the growth of the GDPR ninja or consultant, you will start to see a growth in skilled persons as well, looking to provide these reports. And it's not just going to be fines. Ofcom are going to have the power to issue directions for improvement, to serve notices of non-compliance, but Ofcom isn't going to investigate or arbitrate on an individual case, even though they can accept complaints, even though concerns can be reported to it. What the response said on that point was that the government recognises the need to balance effective enforcement with protecting the attractiveness of the UK as a tech sector and also with users' rights. The regulator will strongly encourage compliance with the regime in the first instance and provide clear grounds for any intervention and escalation. All fairly straightforward. But what's been really controversial in this final response are the business disruption measures I referred to earlier. What that's going to involve is requiring providers such as ISPs to take measures to make it less commercially viable for a non-compliant company to provide services to UK users or withdraw access to key services. That's going to be enforceable through a court order. And that's on the start. A level 2 measure, a level 2 business disruption measure, will include the power to block non-compliant services from being accessible in the UK and to force compliance of infrastructure providers through court orders. But it's worth noting, as I said, that enforcement of the new online harms regime can be pursued against any business, regardless of where it's based, if it provides services to UK users. Again, that's an extraterritorial approach that's very similar to data protection. What this means, of course, is that your presence in the UK is not essential to enforcement action. And although we mentioned the possibility of action being taken against directors and senior managers, that's still left on the table, but it's seen as a last resort. And that kind of enforcement action isn't going to be introduced for at least 2 years after the new legislative framework is brought in, again, mainly to ensure that codes of practice, monetary penalty systems, regulatory action plans are in place so that any business that does fall in scope knows what they need to do to comply, and so do the people that run them. There is going to be an appeal system that will allow for enforcement decisions to be referred to a tribunal based on judicial review procedures or to the High Court, again, through judicial review proceedings. And just because we're doing this first, just because we're the first country in the world to try and make our population in the safest place to be online, doesn't mean that international collaboration is going to stop. Online safety is very much seen as a shared responsibility between governments, never mind government, users and companies. And there's going to be a joined up approach with the ICO and the Competition and Markets Authority, as well as Ofcom, working with each other through the new Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum. So that's, again, a cross-jurisdictional, cross-agency approach. The principles that businesses in scope are going to have to comply with include improving user safety through a risk-based approach that considers harm to individuals, protect children through introducing high levels of protection for any services used by them, to be transparent and accountable, again, very similar to data protection, and increase user awareness about the incidence of and response to harms, foster innovation and reduce the burden on businesses where possible, be proportionate and act in proportion to the severity of harm that we're talking about and the resources available, protect users' rights online, but also including freedom of expression and privacy, and through the introduction of systems and processes that focus on how a business is going to deter harm rather than on individual pieces of content. So having said all that, is this going to work? What will the approach be to regulation? Well, that, of course, is the $64,000 question. Certainly, raising awareness of the issue has moved it up the risk registers of many businesses. And as I've mentioned several times, I'll mention again, without hints of reproach, the UK GDPR and data protection generally is a really useful roadmap and a really useful precedent in terms of the kinds of training management and process and procedures that you may need to put in place, and hinting at the possibility of the appointment of a harm officer. So in data protection regulation, we have the data protection officer. That was a new job title introduced by that legislation. Not many businesses need to have one as a legal requirement, but it may be a good idea to start now and start making this someone's responsibility. The other side of all of this is that application and enforcement in practice isn't well defined because we don't have the codes of practice and it's hard to pin down, and practical yardsticks for the minimum best practice are going to take time to develop and formulate. Again, how is it going to be technically enforceable against businesses outside the UK whose content remains accessible through the legislation seeks to protect? Again, we have business disruption measures, but how and when will they be used? Again, there's a real focus on freedom of expression. As I mentioned earlier, the duty of care we're talking about is a little bit imprecise in that it's promoted by statute as opposed to over case law decisions over 20 or so years. And as I mentioned earlier, Ofcom isn't going to investigate individual complaints. So they are seen as the right regulator, but will that approach change over time? There's an argument that although we have appeals processes and so on and so forth, this may encourage satellite and group litigation. We may see directors on the hook without any real involvement in the wrongdoing of the platforms we're talking about. And we're going to see fines, as you've seen, at roughly the kind of same scale as UK GDPR. And we're going to have a couple of years while businesses get used to what these new proposals actually mean. Of course, between now and the online safety bill actually getting its way into the statute books is an awful lot of lobbying time. And you will see the likes of Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, anybody else working very, very hard to try and take away some of the teeth of these proposals. And again, the question has to be asked in that regard, is Ofcom going to have enough teeth to do what they're being asked to do here? While there are other sanctions that remain on the table at the moment, everything does, and I know that's an overused phrase. You may think that fines, you may think that business disruption is enough, but as the regime evolves, as the Ofcom gets to grips with its new responsibilities, we may see those teeth sharpen pretty significantly. So where do you start with all of this? After you finish crying in a corner, do have a look at the government papers and consultation responses. They're actually pretty interesting and there's a lot of detail in them. Certainly, if you're working with businesses, encourage them to figure out whether or not they do fall in scope. Build a team involving legal, HR, information, tech, compliance and risk management alongside insurance, and think about what the implications of being in scope actually are. Think about how the new requirements can touch the stakeholders, including your supply chain and your contract terms. Think about, as I mentioned earlier, creating a single point of contact with responsibility for dealing with this new regime. This may be a harm officer. Think about to what extent what you do falls within the scope of the new regime, and if you need to or if you want to continue to provide certain services, if you do fall in scope but they're not really vital to a business. And under the leadership of a DPO or under someone in the senior management team's leadership, do a risk assessment similar to a data protection impact assessment to get a really good idea of what activities you provide that could cause online harm. Have a think about your current insurance cover to look at gaps in coverage and any coverage that might protect you from future claims relating to online harms, and think about the scope of cover for regulatory fines. But what I would say in conclusion is watch this space. We're meant to see the online safety bill sometime this year. We're meant to have seen it already. And we're going to see, I would imagine, a draft of it pretty quickly. So hopefully there will be some more clarity after there has been some more lobbying. But what I would say is that this has moved away from being just a broad concept, from something that is nice, that the government wanted to happen, that everyone thinks it's a good idea, to something that is now happening and is going to become an issue, even for a small number of businesses, for some businesses across the UK. That is a lot of information in a short period of time. I am going to make those slides available after I've spell checked them again. If you'd like to have a chat about any of this or just bounce ideas off or talk geek with me, that's where you can find me. And I don't start clocks running just to talk about stuff like this because it's interesting. We've left some time for questions. Does anybody have any?
I haven't had any on the chat, Steve, but I think that's partially because there's so much information to take in. It's a massive amount of information. It's very thorough. I think it's the sort of thing they probably need to take away and think about.
No, I think so. I mean, if you want to do another one of these where we just ask questions, then by all means, or if people have questions they want to fire through, then I'm more than happy to do what I can to answer them. But as I say, we're quite early doors with this, Helen. I think that's fair to say. And we're going to see this narrow a little bit. We're going to see it clarified. But what I was really keen to do, and obviously what the MGAA has been keen to do, is to get this on your radar as early as possible, because good preparation for this is going to make compliance with it a hell of a lot easier.
I was going to say, even though it may be a while off, I think the key message I could see coming through was think about it now, and then you can start to put things in place if necessary slowly, rather than then it becoming a reality and forced on you, and you've suddenly got to rush around and make sure everything is in place. So it's definitely something to think about.
No, that's right. And you mentioned putting things in place slowly. That's an interesting challenge for your likes of Instagram or Facebook, in that whenever they make changes to their user terms, their users go insane. So if they and other businesses start to phase out applications or services or anything else that users have become reliant upon or accustomed to, and it turns out that that's just too much of a risk now, you've got a whole different PR issue and user engagement issue to deal with at the same time. So starting now and weeding out the higher risk elements of what businesses do, as you say, is absolutely, I think, the best use of anybody's time when addressing this.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Just a couple of things before everyone. Oh, hang on. Did you say that this legislation will not apply to business to business?
Yes, it is. It's just B2C.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, all I was going to say was just to add that coming along to this presentation is accredited for CPD points, if that's relevant to your ongoing professional development program. We will put the video on the website and upload it to our YouTube channel so you can watch this over again. As Steve mentioned, the slide deck will be sent out to you, so all this information that you've been hearing about, you'll be able to ponder over and start to formulate your own actions from. We will be sending out a feedback survey after this webinar, so if you could please fill it in and just give us your comments, because it helps with the quality of the events we run going forward, and it means we can tailor things to meet what you want to see and hear as well. And all I need to say really now then is thanks, Steve. That was fantastic. I can't believe you got through all that in that time. It was a massive whistle stop, massive information download. But I think there's plenty for people to think about.
No, thank you, Helen, and thank you, MGA, for giving me this opportunity to speak to the audience. It's been an absolute pleasure, and hopefully we'll be able to speak to you again pretty soon.